Hello there, folks. Okay, I'm going to just continue from the last video, basically, on occupation. Now, it's not often I catch telly, but if I go to people's houses, I do tend to catch it, and it's generally I catch something I need to catch. And in the recent weeks, I've heard two words used. The first was civic duty, and that was dictated by Hancock when he was explaining what people must do as a civic duty. And I just thought, well, I've seen that before. And then there's another one that I've heard said about belligerent. Belligerent. Two words used in the format of occupation. Civic duty and belligerent. So once you start to see this, you can start to recognise the terms that they're using when they're using them. And I think it's extremely important that we start to take notice. I'm back to the Joint Service Manual of the Law of Armed Conflict, and specifically the Joint Service Publication 383, which is the 2004 edition. And in it says, a definition of occupation. It says, territory is considered to be occupied when it is actually placed under the authority of external military forces. Right? External military forces. That's interesting. Occupation extends only to territory where that authority has been established and can in fact be exercised. Now, effectiveness of occupation. Now, this is also the determining factor of the commencement of occupation, and it says, to determine whether a state of occupation exists, it is necessary to look at the area concerned and determine whether two conditions are satisfied. 1. That the former government has been rendered incapable of publicly exercising its authority in that area, so that's specific to the area that's being occupied. And secondly, that the occupying power is in a position to substitute its own authority for that of the former government. Now, I'm sure you've noticed that as this lockdown moved forward, you got the distinct impression that these talking heads have had no power. Absolutely zero power. That they were in fact being told what they had to say each time they stood between those two crosses. That what we witnessed in that, if you so noticed, was the handover from a government that's been somewhere classed as incapable of exercising its authority, and it's been handed over to the occupying power, who has substituted its own authority for that of the former government. Now, in the last video, I said that if you come across British military on the streets here, the first thing you do is ask them if they are operating under the Joint Service Manual of Law of Armed Conflict, specifically Joint Service Publication 383, because that's the format that's been accepted by the British establishment for Britain's involvement in occupations of any kind. So that's what we need to know if they're operating under. And I suggested we're probably not. And, you know, we still have the two possibilities here, and that's the United Nations, who has its own governing authority and can take over quite easily the role of a former government, but also the United States, or federal system of the United States, because of course all titles are registered at the Securities and Exchange Commission. That's all your titles, your birth certificates, etc. are all to be found in the Securities and Exchange Commission, and you will find them in the Edgar files. So again, the federal system of the United States of America could also be more than capable of substituting the former government. And as I said, the words that have been being used now is civic duty and belligerence. Belligerent. So this is, I don't believe, is something new, for the simple reason, when you go to court, you've probably heard it said that you mustn't refuse to do anything. Now, that's because you're classed as a citizen until you show yourself belligerent. Do you understand what I'm saying? That if you go and face any claimed authority from within this occupation, depending on how you present yourself will depend on how that system deals with you. So if you're refusing in any way, shape or form, no matter what, you are going to be classed as belligerent, and you will be then dealt with as a belligerent of or under this occupation. So you sort of forego your citizenship, as you were, because everybody's rights, it's not that your rights are protected, but they cannot interfere with the laws of the occupied force. They cannot remove that system from the public. The inhabitants, and that's another word they use. But as I've said before, this is all dealing on persons. It's not about man or woman. This is all dealing with person. Now, when it comes to again as being applied by the British forces, there is a little paragraph called constitutional position, and it says, since sovereignty does not pass to the occupying power, that power may not change the constitution and domestic laws of the occupied territory, nor set aside the rights of the inhabitants except to the extent permitted under the law of armed conflict. Legislative measures may be taken for the security of the occupying forces, so they can protect themselves, is what it's saying, and they can say. So we were informed early in the lockdown that the military have set up supply chains and for themselves on the land. So that would be a legislative measure taken by the occupying forces for the maintenance of order, as they would say, because that is part of their role as occupying force, and proper administration of the territory, and to enable the occupying power to carry out its obligations. So it's a bit double-edged, is that, to be quite frank. But again, as I said, it's looking to me more like it's dependent upon how you present yourself. Are you a citizen, or are you a belligerent, okay, or enemy? There's different terminology that goes down with this, the way the armed conflict is carried out. And a lot of this is taken from the Geneva Conventions, going back after the First World War, Second World War, etc. So what I like about the Brits' take is they do include a lot of those old, tried and tested protocols, as it were. But clearly that's not, as we've said in the other video, not all these protocols are being upheld, which suggests they're either in breach, the British Army is actually in breach of it, or the British Army is operating for what is classed as a foreign force. Now again, that would cite the United Nations, because we've all signed up to that. But then in 1925, which was the forerunner to the actual 1931 bankruptcy, which was sort of declared in 1933, but the actual format was 1925 to 1931 bankruptcy, where they securitised all our birth certificates, and of course were placed on the Securities and Exchange Commission in America. Just to continue the constitutional position, it says that the occupying power can carry out its obligations under the Convention for the Welfare of the Inhabitants. That the occupying power may, however, repeal or amend laws that are contrary to international law, and is also entitled to make changes mandated or encouraged now by the UN Security Council. So this is how they've used the UN to subvert international law. So for this to be holding good would suggest both the British Army and the American Army are part of would be classed as a foreign military force because of their ties to the United Nations. And thus, both the British Army and the American Army, wherever they may be, providing they get the nod from the United Nations, are operating under the United Nations protocols. And as it's just said there, that the occupying power is entitled to make changes mandated or encouraged by the UN Security Council. So, in that sense, the British Army, each time they breach the Joint Service Publication 383, then they're acting treason. Regardless of the fact that the UN Security Council have encouraged it, liability, self-responsibility, we are all responsible for our actions, regardless of who whispers in our ears. And this is looking more and more like our British Army is on our land, but not as the British Army. That they are on this land under orders of a foreign military power, in this case, the United Nations Security Council. Are we seeing this? That's treason. That's treason by every single soldier, commander, officer, non-commissioned officer who operates in accordance with the United Nations on this land in direct opposition and contradiction to international law and the Joint Service Publication 383. This is serious stuff, folks. This is extremely serious stuff. Now, resistance to occupation. So it says before effective occupation, quote, until the occupation is effective, members of the armed forces of the occupied country, of organised resistance movements and of a levy en masse may figure to resist the invading troops. So basically what it's saying is that there could be a lot of the occupied country's forces may actually try to resist the invading troops who want to occupy. However, they must distinguish themselves from the civilian population by, at the very least, carrying their arms openly during deployments and engagements. So basically what they're saying in there is, if you are opposing this invasion, to be recognised as such, you would have to carry your arms openly. Because if you don't, you are then classed of being treated as an unprivileged belligerent. Unprivileged, can you see? So everything's broke down into the way you present yourself according to these rules. So when you go into court, as I've said, if you get cocky, you're belligerent. You'll be treated exactly as an unprivileged belligerent just by the way you present yourself. So these are the things you need to understand, because you cannot possibly expect to succeed with your own rights, inherent rights, if you want to call them that. But more importantly, let's get into law terminology. What is correct as opposed to what is incorrect. Now, clearly this is incorrect because our forces are not, in my opinion, operating according to their own rules. So they're operating under the United Nations. And I believe that our talking heads are also now operating under this. And they have to go along or they'll be classed as belligerents. So this is some trap that I'm seeing here that's been set up under this occupational garbage. Unprivileged belligerents. Only combatants have the right to participate directly in hostilities. So basically, if you're a combatant, you have the right, under these rules of war, armed conflict, to participate directly in hostilities. Are you getting to see the game now when you're looking over in the Middle East and you see ISIS and this and all that? They're just playing a game, and as long as they're operating under this nonsense, all is well. It's legal. It's not lawful. It's legal. Can you get this? Can you see? There's no declarations of war by the United Nations at all. Everything is done on the legal. And people are not aware of this because they think legal is law, and it's not. It is the laws of a legal body of rules. In this case, we're talking about the rules of armed conflict. So only combatants have the right to participate directly in hostilities. You have a right to. You get that. Now, if civilians take a direct part in hostilities without satisfying the conditions under which they acquire lawful combatant status, see, they even call it lawful, they are not entitled to be treated as belligerents and may be punished by the occupying power. Right? So now you're looking at Northern Ireland. You can see how Northern Ireland were being played out. Yeah? So H Block was for combatants. And if civilians joined in as combatants when they weren't combatants, you were going to get punished. It starts to make a bit of sense when you start to look at it in these terms, these war games that these nutcases love to play everywhere. And the hapless masses have no concept of this kind of stuff and just exist as victims of it. You know? There's no need to be victims of this here. We have access to our law, as is the right under occupation. So the thing that's changing that concept is obviously the United Nations. But again, let me point out very clearly, the United Nations was created by the Rothschilds and those they represent. Israel is also a creation of the Rothschilds and those they represent. They are now going, so they're exposing the United Nations so they can undermine it. So that you lot fall for the game that, oh, well, if it starts anew in Israel, it'll be completely different. No, it will be the same controllers moving this out of the public domain that people actually have access to into this closed dictatorship to be run by the Sanhedrin, the Noahide platform. Are you starting to understand the seriousness of those two concepts together? The destruction of the United Nations, yet everything it's achieved, its power, its authority, its means to affect the world through these systems, is going to move out completely from any form of public influence into the hands of the greatest psychopaths that have ever lived on this earth. Now I can say that because history's long of their deeds and what they do when they get power. And now it's about to happen again because they've got power, but this time they have it across the globe. Are you starting to understand what is actually going on all around you? Occupation. Yeah? The occupation, yet under our army cannot stop us having our rights to law. But under the United Nations they can. So if our soldiers are on our land as a foreign entity, they're not operating for this country anymore. Why are we paying for them? And each and every one of them are in treason. You can't. The soldiers have no idea, but the commanders understand this. Otherwise, they're just not fit for purpose. They shouldn't be in command of soldiers in the theatre of war or occupation, whichever role they're being forced to carry out. However, civilians taking an indirect part in hostilities by, for example, providing information or material assisting escapers and hiding weapons could only be punished if they contravened any laws or regulations passed by the occupying power. So, if these laws are being passed, where are they being passed and why are we not being made aware of them? What is this nonsense? Unprivileged belligerents are in any event entitled to the protection of the Conventions and Protocol 26, although the right of communication may be fortified in the case of spies. So we're looking at unprivileged belligerents. Punishing protected persons, individually or collectively, for offences that they have not committed is unlawful, whether or not such punishment is a reprisal measure in response to the activities of unprivileged belligerents. The personal property of civilians is similarly protected. So, are you a civilian, a belligerent, an unprivileged belligerent, or a combatant? So you're all being broken up into these labels, these boxes. Are you getting it? You're seeing how... So now that the state is... This occupation thing on the United States is running everything. We're losing everything. Which is going against our nation's accepted rules of occupation for our forces. Yeah, it's our forces that are doing it. Can you see? Can you see the bastardisation of everything law and being replaced by everything legal, which is basically the rules of commerce? You're being traded, you're being treated as assets, and in accordance with the 3 World War strategy, telegraphed through Albert Pike after the Civil War in America, that they needed a 3 World War strategy. If they were going to bankrupt all the trusts, they needed the 3 World War strategy in order that they could kill the creditor before they made the claims back for the abuse of that trust. First World War, Second World War, and the plan is for a Third World War with China in 2023. So the West isn't going to win that war because the West are the trusts that are bankrupt. They started all afresh in the East, new trusts, new everything, it's all blank. But now they need to rid themselves of the debt that they've incurred through the sodomizing of your title. Okay? This is where we are at, people. They've brought in all these fresh titles. Are you understanding how this nonsense starts to make sense in that you can now understand, you can grasp what it is that's going on in the entire world? And they have broke it into East-West. This war would not be sustainable by the West because we don't manufacture anymore. You cannot fight a war if you cannot manufacture what is required to fight a war. You can't do it. It's impossible. Impossible. They know that. You're being set up to go for that because you guys don't know this. You guys still think it's Rule Britannia and we're fantastic. We don't make anything. We've no steel industry. Have you any idea how much steel you need for a war? What have they done for the last 20 years? They've brought in all the travellers, and what have they done? They've removed all the metal, all the scrap from the nation. I mean, just go back to Second World War. Everybody's railings were being cut down because they needed it for munitions. You're all on brick walls now. Aluminium buildings. You can't make bullets out of aluminium. Yeah. Lead. Copper coat. Gone. They've stripped everything. So that if we did start a war, it wouldn't be very long before we were absolutely annihilated, because we would run out of everything we need to fight that war. And right now the British Army are acting contrary to the law of this land because they appear to be operating under a foreign military forces command on our land, paid for by us, your brothers, your fathers, yeah, your sisters even, in this mess, about to enact treason like you've never seen. Treason like you've not seen since the Hanoverians came over, since Cromwell did his thing, yeah, since William did his thing and usurped the crowns. This is the final nail in the coffin if this doesn't get seen by lawyers, by you military boys, you police, politicians, everybody. If you don't start to show that you've got some sense and a brain, this is the game we're on. This is game on, people, right now. Duties of the population of occupied territory. Limits of legislative powers of the occupier. The occupying power can create punishable offences in the interests of its security or that of the population in the occupied territory. It cannot compel the population of occupied territory to acknowledge its sovereignty. Okay? Every time you go on lockdown, every time you do what the government say, you are accepting its sovereignty. And the only thing they're using to get you to this fear. Okay, that's how ridiculous we've got these days. It's just... That means civilians cannot be required to take part in operations against their own country. But you are. You are every time you kowtow to this shit. Every time you put a mask on. Every time you social distance. Every time you obey that shit that comes off the telly. You are operating against your own country. By choice. Assist the war effort of the occupying power against their own country. Doing it all by yourself. Loving it. Money! Give me the money! I got 10 grand my shop, I had to shut and blah blah blah. I've been doing all my house up. 30 pieces of silver geezers. Serve in the armed or auxiliary forces of the occupying power. But yet you are. You're all joining police. You're all joining army. You're all joining MI5. You're all joining Freemasonry. Because let's be honest, chaps, the police is Freemasonry. That's what it is. Always has been. This is why I say go for the commanders, because that's what they are. And they are directly operating for the no-hide judges of the 21st degree Scottish Rite. And finally, give information to the occupying power about their own armed forces or other defence information. But you have. And you are. Every time you liaise with a foreign entity. BAE Systems, all these, oh, we're fantastic. That's what you've done. That's what you've done. While the orders of the authorities of an occupying power may be lawful, and while the occupant is entitled to require obedience to lawful orders, it does not necessarily follow that failure to comply with such orders is illegal under the law of armed conflict. Okay, so it's not even illegal if you're not obedient to it. However, the inhabitants are liable for punishment by the occupying power should they disobey legislation, proclamations, regulations or orders properly made by that power. And of course, all the nations, the bankrupt government signed up to the United Nations, operated just such regulations. Person. It's all about person, this, remember. It's not about man, woman. This is the breakup of person under occupation. Civic duty. Hancock likes that new word. In case of necessity, the inhabitants may be called upon for police duty to assist the regular police in the maintenance of public order, for help with firefighting, or to perform other duties that may be required of citizens for the public good. Did you hear that? Called upon for police duty. There's your private security, ladies and gentlemen. There's your litter imps that are finding people all over the place. Are you getting this? That's what you're in. Foreign force. The rights of the inhabitants. The inhabitants must not be deprived, by reason of changes brought about by the occupation, of any of the benefits to which they are entitled under the Convention. An act to facilitate the return to a gold standard and for purposes connected therewith. 13th of May 1925, and it's in relation to the Administration of Justice Act 1925 says, unless and until His Majesty by proclamation otherwise directs, the Bank of England, notwithstanding anything in any act, shall not be bound to pay any note of the bank in this act referred to as the banknote in legal coin within the meaning of Section 6 of the Bank of England Acts 1833, and banknotes shall not cease to be legal tender, by reason that the bank do not continue to pay banknotes in such legal coin. The Bank of England, notwithstanding anything in any act, shall not be bound to pay any note of the bank in this act referred to as the banknote in legal coin within the meaning of Section 6 of the Bank of England Act 1833. And it's no longer bound to, the Bank of England was no longer bound to pay any note in legal coin. Bank of England became pretty worthless in 1925. So this is the forerunner to the 1931 bankruptcy. Chapter 46. An Act to suspend the operation of subsection of Section 1 in the Gold Standard Act 1925 and for the purposes connected therewith. 21st of September 1931. Unless and until His Majesty by proclamation otherwise directs, subsection 2 of Section 1 of the Gold Standard Act 1925 shall cease to have effect, notwithstanding that subsection 1 of the said section remains in force. 2. The Bank of England are hereby discharged from all liabilities in respect of anything done by the Bank in contravention of the provision of the said subsection 2 at any time after the 18th day of September 1931, and no proceedings whatsoever shall be instituted against the Bank or any other person in respect of anything so done as aforesaid. It shall be lawful for the Treasury to make and from time to time vary orders authorising the taking of such measures in relation to the exchanges and otherwise as they may consider expedient for the meeting difficulties arising in connection with the suspension of the gold standard. This subsection shall continue in force for a period of 6 months from the passing of this Act. This is 1931. So the Bank of England now is discharged from all liabilities and no longer needs to basically back its notes in coin, gold coin. Now I'm reading this for the first time, so it probably needs a little bit more investigation as to what it actually means, but I'm definitely giving you the gist of what it is. So let's just take a final look at a run through of occupations that we are aware of in relation to what is the geographical name for these islands, the British Isles. That is their true land nation description, and it's been so since 325 BC. Okay, it's been known as the British Isles. Previous to that, it was Albion. So anything that isn't the British Isles does not denote these lands. It denotes a title that's issued by the occupying force. So if we go back to Rome, once this nation was occupied, it was named Britannia by the Romans as a province of Rome. So that's an occupation title, Britannia. We do know that the original Christianity in Britain was Celtic. And when the Celtic Church opposed the burgeoning Roman Church, the Druids were annihilated, because they represented the Celtic idea of Christianity. Which is still practiced in many places, especially where you'll find a lot of Celts, you know. It's very in tune with nature. Very similar to the original theology you would recognise as Merovingian, to be honest. So, you know, the last Celtic king with any sort of power would have been King Oswald but he was defeated and died in 642 AD. And he went against Rome as a king and went down from Northumbria, crossed over where I am in a place called Oswald's Twistle, because that's what it's named from. His army camped on the moors, and he had his own camp at what is now Church Kirk, which is one of the oldest churches in, I think, Lancashire. So that was, you could say, our last Celtic king in this country. Offa, again, probably the best king of those days, in that he was the only king who dealt with Charlemagne on his own terms. The remaining chiefs and monarchs, etc., across Europe were subdued by Charlemagne, Charles the Great, but not King Offa. He had to deal with King Offa on Offa's own terms, and did. Then we moved, you could say, to Alfred, and a lot of people held him in high regard, and you know, he did do quite a lot of good, but when you look at what he actually did, he basically handed over, or at least gave the Roman Church a huge power in this nation, and set us up basically for the 1066 invasion, which was formulated in the Burgundian monasteries by the children of the elect Carolingians, who through primogeniture weren't the children that were going to inherit the estate, and so they were joining the monasteries, and so they undermined their own houses from that. But then, of course, today they've become it. So there you can see, you know, the first invasion by the Romans, the occupational term was Britannia. The second was well, you could say the second one was probably Alfred, to be clear, and he was big on the term England. So again, even England could actually be a occupational title, because of course it's not the British Isles. Yeah, it's not. And Edward sort of moved against what had been created under William, who brought in the moneylenders, and under royal decree allowed usury in both England and in France. That was William's game, a bit similar to exactly what Oliver Cromwell would do later. But King Edward removed the moneylenders and did appear to be operating quite well in relation to creating or putting us back as a Christian nation. And then, of course, we would have the Templars who had entered Scotland, whom Edward was sort of fighting. And then we would have the Whigamores through the Presbyterians up in Scotland, so obviously agitated by the Templars, I would suggest, who then went on to undermine the English crown through the killing of Charles I with Oliver Cromwell, and then in came again the moneylenders. And George Monk played a very important part in that, General George Monk, by his absence, who was sent up into Scotland, a very known Roman tied general and very powerful man in his day as well. So you could see that it was actually, Cromwell wasn't just operating for what you might call the moneylenders as we would see them today. They were actually also operating in tandem with Rome, because it was they who kept Monk up in Scotland while Oliver Cromwell did his thing. Monk could have stopped Cromwell in an instant, let's put it that way. And of course the Presbyterian Whigamores were behind that attack on the English crown. And then they finally got Charles II in as a puppet king, just to satisfy the populations that all was going back well. But of course Charles II was just a puppet from which we had the Bank of England commissioned, and you could say 1688 the crown of England began to be being usurped through their chosen man, Charles II. So then the next title change, if you will, under occupation was 1707, when we became the Kingdom of Great Britain, which included all the islands around Britain, with the exception of the Isle of Man, which was and remains a crown state, but is not subject to the UK government. And of course the Channel Islands, but they're a part of the Duchy of Normandy. Yet the Duchy of Normandy remain subject to the United Kingdom Crown. So, again, the Kingdom of Great Britain is an occupational title, as is the Kingdom of Great Britain. Okay? Now, it became Britain from 1801. Great Britain. So you can see, these are titles that we hold dear as part of our blighty. But in reality, these are titles under occupation. And as I've just explained, the 1925 is the one that we're dealing with today. And the consequences of securing our birth certificates and bankrupting them. So now they need to get rid of the creditors if they can. By consent, of course. So if you all go off and join the army, you've consented to kill yourself in order that those that owe debt to us all have no debt anymore. They've set up the new game in the East, etc. So the title of occupation post 1707 was the Kingdom of Great Britain, without the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands, which come under the Duchy of Normandy. Now we're now today under the United Kingdom, another occupational title. So that puts UKIP, shows you exactly what UKIP were all about. They weren't claiming to be of the land. They were a United Kingdom party. We also have a claimant to the throne today, who claims to be the King of the UK. Why would you claim to be the king of a occupational title? You cannot inherit the land if you're coming from the sea. So that begs a question that needs to be answered by said claimant. So I just wanted to put that forward so that you can start to allow this stuff to enter your mind, because this is where we're going to get to use our law in relation to the British Army are on the land, but it would appear they're probably not working to their own occupational rules of occupation of the United Nations. And I would suggest the same goes for the Americans as well. I'm not buying that Trump is opposing the United Nations for any other reason than to ensure, as King Cyrus, as he's being depicted on the coins in Israel, as the man who will emancipate the supremacists once again and build a temple, the third temple. Are you starting to understand these concepts now of what's actually happened? Yeah, we've been subverted. It's been going on for a very long time, but especially since the end of the Battle of Waterloo, previous to which the English royal family have been completely bankrupted and in debt to the Rothschilds, from which they sired Queen Victoria. I do believe the original Greg Gallert, if that is the case, brought truth to the table. But then, as we all know, if you are going to move a new idea, you have to give out at least 80% of stuff that's viable. In order, you can either obfuscate the other 20% so that it keeps them off the scent, or to take them down another dead end. And I do believe these are questions that need to be answered now. But more importantly, that you start to understand title, occupation, the rules of occupation, how they're being broken. And the question now is, who are the British Army operating for? Is it a foreign force, yet they're on our land? So these are the questions now we need to start to mull on and understand. Because this, I believe, is where it's at, people. So we're going to do another part on this. I've not finished. There's enough grammar there for you to absorb. I'm sure it's more than enough at this point, because I'm still absorbing it myself. It's new. It's new concepts. But the more I look at it, the more I can actually see this being in action and the active force in relation to everything that's gone on for at least a couple of centuries. In fact, from 1707, you can say. But it never ends. You know what I'm saying? It just goes back. But especially in relation to what we're dealing with now, we're looking at 1925. as a precursor to the actual bankruptcy in 1931 when we removed us from the gold standard and the Bank of England orders nothing. And we got the paper money, worthless money, debt money. Yeah, securitised our birth certificates, and they've bankrupted them. They've bankrupted them, and they don't want to pay that debt back to you. Why would they? The criminals, the mafia. Why would they want to pay you back? No, what they want to do now is get you to kill yourself. You've been doing that with medication for God knows how, well, since the Second World War and the launch of the National Health Service. You've been doing it if you go off to war. You know, there are many ways that you are consensually killing yourself right now to satisfy this agenda, as telegraphed by Albert Pike, of killing the creditor before they find out. And then to do it again. Yeah, this is the final one, the Third World War, if this goes off. This is the finale of this agenda, as telegraphed by Albert Pike. You really need to start to understand these concepts, people, because otherwise you're pissing in the wind. And to be frank, right now, pissing in the wind is not something we want to be doing. We need to be starting to move against this by first understanding it, and then reckoning with the powers and authorities and laws that counter this. Because as I've said before, our ancestors once upon a time were very smart. Something seriously went wrong somewhere, but that's for another video. So, until the next time.